Hey everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Tonight, we're journeying back in time, not to the vibrant studios of Florence or the grand halls of Rome, but to the world that came before all that. We're talking about the era often called the Dark Ages, a period that set the stage for one of history's most brilliant explosions of creativity, the Renaissance. So, what was life really like in Europe before the 14th century? Was it truly all darkness and gloom? Let's find out. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. To understand the dawn, we have to understand the night. The period we're exploring, roughly from the 5th to the 14th century, is also known as the Middle Ages. It began with the collapse of a titan, the Western Roman Empire. Imagine a world where the central government, the network of roads, and the legal systems that had held society together for centuries suddenly crumbled. What would you do? Where would you go? Chaos ensued. Invasions from various groups were common. Trade routes were disrupted, and grand cities shrank into shadows of their former selves. People retreated into smaller, more defensible communities. Life became overwhelmingly local. Your entire world might be the village you were born in and the fields surrounding it. The grand, unified vision of Rome was replaced by a fragmented patchwork of feudal kingdoms. At the heart of this new world was the feudal system. It was a social pyramid, a structure built on loyalty and land. At the top was the king, who granted land or fiefs to powerful nobles, the lords and barons. In exchange, these nobles pledged their military service and loyalty. Below them were knights, the professional warrior class, who in turn protected the land and the people on it. And at the very bottom, forming the vast majority of the population, were the peasants or serfs. For a serf, life was a cycle of hard labor dictated by the seasons. You worked the Lord's land, and in return you got a small strip of land for your own family and, most importantly, protection. It wasn't slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. You were tied to the land, unable to leave without the Lord's permission. Life expectancy was short, and survival was a daily struggle against famine, disease, and the hardships of manual labor. Yet, it's a mistake to think of this time as a complete intellectual and cultural void. In the midst of this political fragmentation, one institution grew incredibly powerful and served as a unifying force across Europe. The church, cathedrals, and monasteries became the new centers of life, not just for worship, but for everything. Think of monasteries as the hard drives of the medieval world. While many classical texts from Greece and Rome were lost or forgotten in the West, monks painstakingly copied and preserved what remained. They were the scholars, the librarians, and the educators of their time. They preserved knowledge of medicine, agriculture, and philosophy, keeping the embers of ancient wisdom glowing through a long, dark night. Latin, the language of the church, was the universal language of learning, connecting scholars from England to Italy. And the art of this period, it was almost exclusively religious. It wasn't meant to be realistic in the way we think of Renaissance art. Its purpose was to tell a story, to teach the largely illiterate population about the Bible. The figures in stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, and church sculptures might look flat or disproportionate to our eyes, but they were powerful symbols communicating complex theological ideas to the faithful. Their beauty was in their spiritual message, not their anatomical accuracy. So, where did the first hints of change, the first rays of dawn, begin to appear? The seeds of the Renaissance were sown in the later Middle Ages, starting around the 11th century. One of the biggest catalysts was the Crusades. While often seen as purely military campaign, the Crusades reopened contact between Western Europe and the more advanced Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Knights and merchants traveling to the east brought back more than just battle stories. They brought back new goods, spices, silk, and sugar. They brought back new ideas, rediscovering forgotten texts of Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, which had been preserved and studied by Arab scholars. This influx of knowledge sparked a new curiosity about the world. Trade began to flourish again, especially in Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. Their strategic location on the Mediterranean made them the perfect gateways for this new wave of commerce. As merchants grew wealthier, a new class of people emerged, one that wasn't defined by land ownership like the old nobility. This was the nascent middle class, the bourgeoisie. They had money, and they wanted to enjoy it. They began to patronize arts and learning for reasons beyond pure religious devotion. At the same time, universities started to pop up across Europe in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These weren't just for training priests anymore. They became centers for debating law, medicine, and philosophy. A new way of thinking began to take hold. A spirit of inquiry and a desire to understand the natural world through reason and observation. And then, just as Europe seemed to be on an upward trajectory, disaster struck. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across the continent. It was a pandemic of unimaginable scale, wiping out at least a third of the population. It was a catastrophic event that shook the foundations of medieval society. The old feudal order, already strained, began to crack. With so many workers gone, the value of labor skyrocketed. Peasants could demand better wages and more freedom. Some began to question the authority of both the church and the nobility, who could unprotect them from this invisible enemy. It's a strange paradox of history, but this immense tragedy actually accelerated the changes that were already underway. The Black Death created a social and economic vacuum, shaking people out of their traditional roles and forcing them to reevaluate their world. It created a sense of urgency, a feeling that life was fragile and should be lived to the fullest. This was the world on the eve of the Renaissance, a world recovering from trauma but also buzzing with new possibilities. The rigid structures of the Middle Ages were breaking down. A new wealthy class was eager to spend money on culture. Lost knowledge was being rediscovered, and a new spirit of human-centered inquiry, which we now call humanism, was beginning to blossom. Europe had endured centuries of fragmentation and hardship, but it had also preserved vital knowledge and built the foundations for something new. It wasn't a sudden leap from darkness to light. It was a gradual awakening, a slow dawn that had been breaking for centuries. The stage was now set for the incredible explosion of art, science, and philosophy that would redefine not just Europe, but the entire world. The impact of the Black Plague on the beginning of the Renaissance. We're journeying back in time to one of the most transformative periods in human history. The Renaissance, we often picture it as this sudden explosion of art, science, and genius think. Leonardo da Vinci sketching flying machines, or Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. But what if I told you that this incredible rebirth of culture was born from the ashes of one of the darkest chapters in European history? That's right. We're talking about the Black Death. It might sound strange, but the devastating plague of the mid-14th century set the stage for the Renaissance in ways you might not expect. So, close your eyes and let's explore how a catastrophic pandemic helped spark a golden age. Before we can understand the rebirth, we need to understand the world that came before it. Europe in the early 14th century was dominated by the medieval mindset. Life was largely governed by a strict feudal system and the overwhelming authority of the Catholic Church. The Church was the center of everything. It dictated art, science, politics, and how people understood their place in the universe. The focus was heavily on the afterlife, with earthly existence seen mostly as a test or a period of suffering to endure. Art was primarily religious, symbolic, and two-dimensional, not meant to be a realistic portrayal of the world, but a reminder of divine truths. Society was rigid. You were born into your social class, a peasant, a knight, a nobleman, that was pretty much your destiny. There wasn't a lot of room for individual ambition or social mobility. Hard life was short, and it was all considered part of God's unshakable plan. It was a world built on tradition, faith, and a clear, unyielding hierarchy, but this entire structure was about to be shaken to its very core. Then, in 1347, everything changed. Flea-infested rats aboard merchant ships arriving in Sicily brought with them a terrifying, unseen passenger, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the bubonic plague. It spread like wildfire. From Italy, it swept across the entire European continent, leaving devastation in its wake. This wasn't just another disease. This was an apocalypse. Contemporary accounts describe cities where the living were scarcely enough to bury the dead. The plague wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population in just a few years. Imagine losing 1 out of every 2 people you know. The social, psychological, and economic impact was unimaginable. The world was plunged into chaos and terror. People believed it was the wrath of God, the end of days. The very foundations of their world were crumbling, and no one, from the poorest peasant to the richest lord, was safe. This immense loss of life, this profound shared trauma, would paradoxically become the fertile ground from which the Renaissance would grow. So, how does a massive plague lead to a cultural explosion? Let's start with the economy. With so many people gone, the most immediate effect was a severe labor shortage. Suddenly, the peasants and artisans who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Landowners and guilds were desperate for workers. So for the first time, common laborers could demand higher wages and better working conditions. This completely disrupted the old feudal system. Many serfs abandoned the manors they were tied to, seeking better opportunities in the cities. This led to a huge increase in social mobility. A person's destiny was no longer sealed at birth. This newfound economic freedom created a growing middle class of merchants, bankers, and skilled tradesmen with disposable income. And what do people with extra money do? They start spending it not just on necessities, but on luxuries, on education for their children, and, crucially, on art. This created a whole new market for culture that was unjust controlled by the church or the old nobility. The psychological impact was just as profound. The plague shattered people's blind faith in old institutions. The church, which was supposed to offer divine protection and answers, had proven powerless. Prayers and penance hadn't stopped the disease. This led to widespread disillusionment, but also a new kind of thinking. If the old ways failed, maybe it was time to look for new answers. People began to question authority and tradition in a way they never had before. There was also a massive shift in attitude towards life itself. When you've witnessed death on such an epic scale, you develop a new appreciation for the time you have. The focus began to shift away from solely preparing for the afterlife and towards making the most of life on earth here and now. This celebration of human experience, of the beauty and potential of the individual, is the very essence of Renaissance humanism. It was a radical departure from the medieval mindset, a turn towards appreciating the human, the worldly, and the tangible. And this is where the money and the new mindset collide, particularly in the city-states of Italy. Like Florence, Italy was the gateway for trade with the Eastern. Unfortunately, the gateway for the plague, but after the pandemic, its strategic location allowed it to recover faster. Wealthy banking and merchant families, like the famous Medici in Florence, amassed incredible fortunes. They were the new power players, but they weren't old-world aristocrats. They were self-made men who wanted to display their wealth and status. And how did they do that? By becoming patrons of the arts. They commissioned magnificent paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects. They poured money into libraries and funded scholars to rediscover the lost knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. This patronage was the fuel that powered the Renaissance engine. Artists were no longer just anonymous craftsmen working for the church. They were celebrated geniuses, competing for commissions and fame. This created an incredibly dynamic and competitive environment where innovation and creativity flourished. The focus of art also changed. While religious themes remained popular, we start to see more portraits, scenes from classical mythology, and an intense focus on realism and human anatomy, all hallmarks of the humanist celebration of the individual and the natural world. The rediscovery of classical texts was another key element before the plague. Many of the great works of Greek and Roman philosophers, scientists, and writers were lost to Western Europe. But as humanist scholars, funded by the new patrons, began searching old monastic libraries and reaching out to the Byzantine Empire, they unearthed a treasure trove of ancient wisdom. Thinkers like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, championed the study of these classical authors. They believed that by studying the achievements of antiquity, they could create a new, better age. This led to a revolution in education. The focus shifted from purely theological studies to the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. The goal was to create well-rounded, virtuous, and eloquent citizens. This classical revival provided the intellectual framework for the Renaissance. It gave artists and thinkers new models to emulate and new ideas to explore, challenging the dominance of medieval scholasticism and paving the way for a more secular, rational, and scientific worldview. And so, the seeds planted in the aftermath of the plague began to blossom. The Renaissance wasn't a single event, but a sprawling, complex movement that unfolded over centuries. In Florence, we see Brunelleschi engineering his magnificent dome, a feat of genius not seen since ancient Rome. We see Donatello reinventing sculpture with his lifelike, emotionally charged statue. And of course, we see the rise of the high Renaissance masters. Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man whose curiosity knew no bounds. Michelangelo, whose divine artistry in sculpture and painting left the world in awe. And Raphael, whose works achieved a harmony and grace that defined the era. From Italy, these new ideas spread across Europe, carried by the printing press, another game-changing invention of the period. The Renaissance took on different flavors in different places. In the north, it was more focused on religious reform and minute realism in painting, with artists like Dürer and Van Eyck. in England. It culminated in the literary explosion of the Elizabethan era with William Shakespeare. It was a continent-wide awakening. Looking back, it's a powerful lesson in how history works. It's rarely a straight line of progress. Often, periods of immense creativity and growth emerge from times of crisis and collapse. The Black Death was an unspeakable tragedy, but it acted as a violent catalyst, breaking down a rigid and stagnant society. It cleared the way for new economic realities, new social structures, and most importantly, new ways of thinking. It forced people to reevaluate their world, their faith, and their own humanity. The Renaissance, with its glorious celebration of human potential, art, and knowledge, was, in many ways, a direct response to that trauma-defiant affirmation of life in the face of death. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, the seeds of renewal and rebirth can be sown. It's a fascinating example of how interconnected history truly is. The role of monks and monasteries in preserving classical texts. Imagine a world without the wisdom of Plato, the logic of Aristotle, or the eloquence of Cicero. A world where the foundations of modern science, philosophy, and democracy simply vanished. It sounds like a dystopian novel, doesn't it? But this alternate reality was a very real possibility. So, who do we have to thank for preventing this catastrophic loss of knowledge? The answer might surprise you. It wasn't kings or generals, but humble monks working silently within the stone walls of monasteries across Europe. We're journeying back in time to uncover the incredible and often overlooked story of how these dedicated men became the unlikely guardians of Western civilization. Let's set the stage. The period we often call the Dark Ages, following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, was a time of immense turmoil. Libraries were burned, centers of learning were destroyed, and literacy plummeted. The great works of ancient Greece and Rome, texts that had shaped an empire, were scattered and in danger of being lost forever. But amidst this chaos, a quiet revolution was taking place inside the monasteries. These weren't just places of prayer, they were becoming fortresses of knowledge. From the rugged islands of Ireland to the sun-baked hills of Italy, monks embarked on a monumental task, copying manuscript. This was their sacred duty, a form of worship known as ora et labora, pray and work. In a special room called a scriptorium, monks would spend countless hours, often in dim, cold conditions, meticulously transcribing texts by hand. They used quill pens and ink they made themselves, writing on parchment or vellum, which were durable materials made from animal skin. It was slow, painstaking work. A single book could take months or even years to complete. Think about that dedication. Every letter, every word, every intricate illustration was a deliberate act of preservation. But they weren't just human photocopiers. These monks were scholars in their own right. They had to be fluent in Latin and often Greek. As they copied, they would sometimes add their own notes in the margins, called scholia. These notes could be anything from a clarification of a difficult passage to a complaint about the cold or the poor quality of the ink. These little human touches, preserved for centuries, give us a direct connection to the minds of these scribes. They weren't just saving the words. They were engaging with the ideas, keeping the intellectual conversation alive through the centuries. They developed new, more readable scripts, like the Carolingian minuscule, which introduced lowercase letters and spacing between words, making texts easier to read for generations to come. As Europe began to stabilize and move towards the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, a new hunger for this ancient knowledge emerged. Scholars, artists, and thinkers wanted to reconnect with the classical past. And where did they go to find it? The monasteries. These institutions had become vast libraries, treasure troves of antiquity. Figures like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, dedicated their lives to hunting for these lost texts. He would travel from one monastery to another, digging through dusty archives, uncovering forgotten works by authors like Each discovery was a cause for celebration, like finding a map to a lost world. The rediscovery of these texts was the spark that ignited the Renaissance flame. When scholars read Plato's ideas about the ideal state, it profoundly influenced political thought. When architects studied Vitruvius's De Architectura, it revolutionized building design, leading to masterpieces like Brunelleschi's Dome in Florence. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci didn't just study human anatomy. They were inspired by the classical ideals of beauty, harmony, and proportion found in the ancient sculptures and texts that had been saved by the monks. It was a chain reaction. Science, art, politics, philosophy of every field of human endeavor was supercharged by this sudden influx of ancient wisdom. It's also crucial to remember the role of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, in the Islamic world. While Western monasteries preserved Latin texts, scholars in Constantinople and across the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age were preserving and, importantly, translating and building upon Greek texts. They studied Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen, making huge advancements in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. When Constantinople fell in 1453, many Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them a wealth of Greek manuscripts and knowledge that Western Europe had largely lost. This fusion of Latin traditions from the West and Greek traditions from the East created the perfect intellectual storm for the High Renaissance. The monks had kept the embers glowing, and this new influx of knowledge was the fuel that set Europe ablaze with creativity and discovery. But the story doesn't end there. Around the mid-5th century, a goldsmith from Mainz, Germany, named Johannes Gutenberg, perfected a technology that would change the world forever: the printing press. Suddenly, the work that took among a year to complete could be replicated hundreds of times in a week. And what were the first books to be printed? The Bible, of course. But right alongside it were the classical texts that the monks had so painstakingly preserved. The printing press took the knowledge locked away in monasteries and democratized it, spreading the ideas of the Renaissance across Europe like wildfire. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the monks' quiet work. Their centuries of labor had created the content for a communications revolution. So, when we look at a magnificent Renaissance painting, read a play by Shakespeare, or even debate ideas in a modern university, we are standing on the shoulders of these unsung heroes, the monks in their scriptoria, with their quiet dedication and unwavering belief in the power of knowledge, built a bridge across the centuries. They ensured that the conversation of humanity was not silenced by the fall of an empire. They were the guardians of the flame, the keepers of our collective memory. Their legacy is not written in stone monuments, but in the very pages of the books that define our world and in the ideas that continue to shape our future. The Italian Wars and their influence on art. We're journeying back to a time of both breathtaking beauty and brutal conflict. The Renaissance, specifically, we're diving into a series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, which raged from 1494 to 1559, and exploring how this era of turmoil unexpectedly fueled one of the greatest artistic flowerings in human history. So, picture this: late 15th century Italy. It's not a single country like it is today, but a patchwork of powerful, wealthy, and fiercely competitive city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States in Rome. These states were the epicenters of the Renaissance, pouring immense wealth into art and architecture. But their wealth and strategic location in the Mediterranean also made them a tantalizing prize for the growing monarchies of Europe, namely France and Spain. In 1494, the French king, Charles VIII, marched his army into Italy to press a claim on the Kingdom of Naples. This single act shattered a fragile peace and kicked off decades of warfare. Suddenly, the Italian peninsula became the primary battlefield for the ambitions of foreign kings. Armies crisscrossed the landscape, cities were besieged, and political power shifted like sand in the wind. It was a period of immense instability and violence. You might think this would be the end of art, right? But what happened was far more complex and fascinating. One of the most immediate effects was the displacement of artists. When political tides turned, patrons were overthrown, or cities were sacked, artists had to flee. Take Leonardo da Vinci, for example. He was working for Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. But when the French invaded and captured the city in 1499, Leonardo was forced to leave. He traveled to Venice, then Florence, and eventually even to France to work for King Francis I. This wasn't just a personal disruption, it was a cultural cross-pollination event. Artists like Leonardo carried their innovative techniques like his famous asterisk, sfumato asterisk, that smoky, hazy effect to new regions, introducing them to artists and patrons who might never have seen them otherwise. This scattering of talent accelerated the spread of high Renaissance ideals across Italy and even beyond the Alps. The wars also brought a new and powerful group of patrons onto the scene. The foreign invaders themselves. Kings like Francis I of France and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V were not just warlords. They were highly educated and ambitious rulers who understood the power of art as propaganda. They wanted to project an image of culture, sophistication, and divine right. And what better way to do that than by hiring the best artists in the world? Francis I became a legendary patron. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to his court, giving him a prestigious role and a peaceful place to spend his final years. It's thanks to Francis that the Mona Lisa ended up in France, where it remains in the Louvre today. He also commissioned works from other Italian masters, like Benvenuto Cellini and Andrea del Sarto, bringing the elegance of the Italian Renaissance directly into the heart of the French court and inspiring a whole new generation of French artists. But the influence wasn't just about hiring artists. The themes of art began to change to, in an age of constant conflict, patrons became increasingly interested in subjects that reflected their reality. The demand for grand battle scenes soared. These weren't just chaotic brawls. They were carefully composed narratives designed to glorify a specific victory or patron. Think of the massive frescoes in the Vatican's Stanze di Raffaello, like the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Painted by Raphael and his workshop, these works used the dynamic, muscular style of the High Renaissance to depict historical and religious battles, subtly linking the Pope's current political struggles with moments of divine triumph from the past. Art became a tool to legitimize power and immortalize military glory. At the same time, the instability led to a surge in religious art, but with a new emotional intensity. The sack of Rome in 1527 by the troops of Emperor Charles V was a profoundly traumatic event. The city, seen as the heart of Christendom, was brutally pillaged. This event sent shockwaves through the art world. The confident, harmonious, and idealized beauty of the High Renaissance, perfected by Raphael just a few years earlier, suddenly seemed inadequate to express the anxiety and despair of the times. This is where we see the rise of mannerism. Artists like Pontormo and Rosso Fiorentino began to reject the perfect balance and rational space of the High Renaissance. Their work features elongated figures in contorted, unnatural poses, jarring colors, and crowded, ambiguous compositions. Look at Pontormo's Deposition from the Cross. The figures seem to float in a space without gravity. Their faces filled with anguish and confusion. The colors are a swirl of pastel pinks and blues that feel unsettling. This was an art of crisis, reflecting a world that no longer felt stable, orderly, or divinely protected. The Italian wars didn't create mannerism out of thin air, but the trauma and uncertainty they caused certainly acted as a powerful catalyst for this new, more introspective and emotionally charged style. Let's not forget the material side of things. War is expensive, and it redirects resources. Some artistic projects were delayed or abandoned altogether. The tomb of Pope Julius II, Michelangelo's famously ambitious project, was downsized multiple times over several decades due to the Pope's shifting priorities, which were often focused on military campaigns and diplomacy. The tragedy of the tomb, as it was called, shows how even a master like Michelangelo was at the mercy of the political and financial turmoil of the wars. So, as we can see, the Italian wars were a double-edged sword for the Renaissance. They brought destruction, displacement, and profound uncertainty. Yet, paradoxically, they also sparked an incredible exchange of ideas, introduced new and powerful patrons, and pushed the artists to develop new styles, like mannerism, to grapple with a changing world. The conflict forced artists out of their local bubbles, spreading the Renaissance style far and wide. It turned art into a powerful tool for international propaganda and created a demand for works that reflected the drama and intensity of the era. The story of the Italian wars and their impact on art is a powerful reminder that creativity doesn't just happen in times of peace and prosperity. Sometimes it is in the crucible of conflict and chaos that the most profound and lasting artistic innovations are forged. The beautiful, timeless art of the Renaissance is inextricably linked to the turbulent, violent history that shaped it. Picture this: Italy, the 14th century. The world is waking up from a long sleep, and a new dawn is breaking. We call it the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and ideas. At the heart of this incredible explosion of creativity were three rival cities, each vying for the title of the greatest in the world: Florence, Venice, and Rome. This wasn't just a friendly competition. It was a fierce, multi-generational battle for power, prestige, and legacy, fought not with armies, but with brushes, chisels, and blueprints. Get ready, because today we're diving into the ultimate Renaissance rivalry. First up, Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance. Imagine walking through its streets in the 1400s. Everywhere you look, you see genius at work. This city, a republic fiercely proud of its independence, was the ultimate incubator for new ideas. It was fueled by the colossal wealth of its banking families, most famously, the Medici. They weren't just bankers. They were the ultimate patrons of the arts. Cosimo and later Lorenzo de' Medici poured their fortunes into sponsoring artists who would change the world forever. Think about it. Brunelleschi, who engineered the magnificent, seemingly impossible dome of the Florence Cathedral, a symbol of the city's ambition. Donatello, who brought statues to life with unprecedented realism. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, two titans, whose early careers were forged in the competitive workshops of Florence. The city's currency wasn't just the gold florin, it was talent. Florence's flex was its raw, groundbreaking, artistic, and intellectual power. They were the innovators, the trendsetters, the ones who wrote the rule book for the Renaissance. But while Florence was building its legacy on land, another power was ruling the seas. Let's travel northeast to Venice. La Serenissima, the most serene republic. Venice was different. It wasn't a city of hills and towers like Florence. It was a city of water and light, a glittering jewel built on a lagoon. Its power and wealth came not from banking, but from trade. Venetian ships dominated the Mediterranean, bringing back exotic goods, spices, and incredible riches from the east. This constant flow of commerce and culture gave Venice a uniquely cosmopolitan and vibrant character. This wealth translated into a very different kind of art. Venetian painters like Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese were masters of color and light, while Florentine art was often focused on drawing, precision, and intellectual concepts. Venetian art was a feast for the senses. It was dramatic, emotional, and filled with a love for lavish textures and rich, glowing colors, reflecting the city's own opulence. Venice's rivalry with Florence wasn't just about who had the better artists. It was a clash of philosophies. Was greatness found in intellectual rigor and perfect form, or in sensual beauty and vibrant color? Venice, with its powerful navy and global trade network, confidently projected its answer across the waves. And then there was Rome. For much of the early Renaissance, Rome was a shadow of its former glory, a city of ancient ruins. But in the late 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, it came roaring back. Its power source was unique. The papacy, the popes, figures like Julius II and Leo X were determined to restore Rome to its rightful place as the head of the Christian world, the Caput Mundi. And how did they do it? By launching the most ambitious urban renewal and art commissioning project the world had ever seen. The popes had one major advantage. They could summon the greatest talents from all over Italy. They essentially poached the superstars from Florence and elsewhere. Michelangelo was called to Rome to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a work of such divine scale it left the world breathless. Raphael was brought in to decorate the papal apartments with his harmonious and graceful frescoes. The rivalry became a talent war. Rome's ambition was to synthesize the best of everything that came before the intellectual power of Florence, the grandeur of its own ancient past, and create something even greater, a new golden age. So you have this incredible triangle of power: Florence, the intellectual heart, priding itself on being the birthplace of genius; Venice, the wealthy merchant republic, dazzling the world with its color and commercial might; and Rome, the spiritual center, using its immense authority to create a new imperial splendor. This competition was a powerful engine for innovation. Artists and architects were constantly trying to outdo one another. When Florence unveiled Brunelleschi's dome, the world took notice. When the Pope commissioned the new St. Peter's Basilica, it was a direct challenge to every other cathedral in Christendom. The rivalry played out in personal duels. The famous tension between Leonardo and Michelangelo in Florence is legendary. They were given competing commissions to paint battle scenes in the same government hall, a direct public face-off between the established master and the fiery young prodigy. These personal and civic rivalries pushed the artists to their absolute limits, forcing them to innovate, to experiment, and to achieve heights of creativity they might never have reached otherwise. It was a high-stakes game where the prize was immortal fame, and the playing field was the very soul of Western civilization. In the end, who won? It's impossible to say. Each city gave the world unique and priceless gifts. Florence gave us the intellectual spark and the foundations of Renaissance art. Venice gave us a world of color, emotion, and global perspective. And Rome gave us a vision of sublime, monumental grandeur that continues to inspire all. The real winner wasn't a single city, but humanity itself. This incredible rivalry, this three-way battle for prestige, fueled the golden age of creativity that defined the modern world and continues to enrich our lives today. The competition between Florence, Venice, and Rome is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest leaps forward happen when we strive to be the best. Have you ever wondered who paid for all that magnificent art during the Renaissance? We see Michelangelo's, David, Leonardo's, Mona Lisa, and think of them as lone geniuses. But behind almost every great masterpiece, there was a powerful and wealthy patron pulling the strings, and more importantly, opening their wallet. This isn't just a story about art. It's a story about power, prestige, and how money shaped the very course of Western culture. So, what exactly was patronage? Simply put, it was a system where wealthy individuals, families, or institutions like the church or city guilds commissioned artists to create specific works. Think of it as the ultimate bespoke service. You weren't just buying a painting off the shelf. You were hiring a genius to bring your vision to life. This relationship was the engine of the Renaissance. Without patrons, the explosion of creativity we so admire might never have happened. Let's travel back to 14th century Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance. The city was booming. Wealth wasn't just inherited anymore. It was being created by a new class of merchants and bankers. Families like the Medici weren't just rich, they were dynastic. And what's the best way to show off your wealth and power when everyone is rich? Through culture. Sponsoring art became the ultimate status symbol. It was a way to say, I'm not just wealthy, I'm sophisticated, pious, and a pillar of this community. The Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch of the Medici Pancan dynasty. He was a master of soft power. Instead of just building fortresses, he invested heavily in art and architecture. He supported artists like Donatello and Fra Angelico, and funded the construction of Brunelleschi's magnificent dome for the Florence Cathedral. Every time someone looked up at that dome, they weren't just seeing a feat of engineering. They were seeing the power and influence of the Medici family. It was public relations on a grand scale, turning Florence into a living museum of their legacy. The relationship between artists and patron was complex. It was part employer-employee, part collaborator, and sometimes even part friendship. Patrons didn't just hand over a bag of gold. They were deeply involved in the creative process. Contracts were incredibly detailed, specifying the subject matter, the size of the work, the quality of materials to be used, even the amount of expensive ultramarine blue pigment, which was worth more than gold at the time. Sometimes the patron would even request to be painted into the scene, often as a pious onlooker in a religious painting, a clever way to secure both social status on earth and perhaps a few bonus points in the afterlife. Now, let's talk about the biggest patron of them all, the church. For centuries, the Catholic Church was the primary commissioner of art. Cathedrals, chapels, and altarpieces were designed to inspire awe and devotion in the largely illiterate population. Art was the Bible for the masses. The stories of saints, the life of Christ, The terrifying scenes of the Last Judgment Hall were brought to life in vivid color and dramatic form. But during the High Renaissance, the papacy in Rome took patronage to a whole new level. Enter Pope Julius II, a man with ambition as big as St. Peter's Basilica itself, which, by the way, he commissioned. Known as the Warrior Pope, Julius wasn't content with just spiritual power. He wanted Rome to be the undeniable cultural capital of the world, and he knew just the men for the job. He famously put two of the greatest artistic rivals of all time, Michelangelo and Raphael, to work in the Vatican simultaneously. Imagine the pressure and the creative energy in the air. Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo, who considered himself a sculptor first and foremost, was reluctant. The story goes that he complained and argued, but the Pope was insistent. The result, one of the absolute pinnacles of human achievement. Over 4 years, Michelangelo lay on his back on scaffolding, creating over 300 figures that would redefine the possibilities of painting. Meanwhile, just a few steps away, the younger and more affable Raphael was decorating the Pope's personal apartments, now known as the Raphael Rooms. His masterpiece, The School of Athens, is a perfect embodiment of the Renaissance spirit. It depicts all the great thinkers of antiquity gathered together, with Plato and Aristotle at the center. It's a celebration of human knowledge and wisdom, commissioned by the head of the church. This shows the incredible fusion of classical philosophy and Christian theology that defined the era. Julius II wasn't just decorating his home. He was making a powerful statement about his role as a leader of both a spiritual and an intellectual world. But patronage wasn't just about popes and bankers. As the Renaissance spread across Europe, different models emerged. In Venice, a maritime republic, the state and civic organizations called squall were major patrons. They commissioned grand narrative paintings from artists like Titian and Tintoretto to decorate their meeting halls, celebrating the history and glory of their city. In Northern Europe, a growing merchant class created a market for smaller-scale art. Wealthy citizens wanted portraits of themselves and their families, scenes of everyday life, and detailed still lifes to hang in their homes. This created new opportunities for artists like Hans Holbein and Jan van Eyck. So, was this system perfect? Not at all. It was incredibly competitive. Artists had to be not just talented, but also savvy networkers and businessmen. They depended entirely on the whims and tastes of their patrons. A change in fortune or a falling out could ruin a career. The creative freedom we associate with artists today was a luxury few could afford. An artist like Leonardo da Vinci was notorious for being unreliable and leaving projects unfinished, which often infuriated his patrons. But his sheer genius allowed him to get away with it. Most artists weren't so lucky. Ultimately, the phenomenon of patronage was a double-edged sword. It could be restrictive, but it also provided the financial stability and the ambitious projects that pushed artists to new heights. It created a competitive environment where innovation was rewarded. The patrons, in their quest for glory, piety, and prestige, fueled a cultural fire that illuminated the world. They may not have held the brush or the chisel themselves, but their vision and their wealth are embedded in every fresco, statue, and canvas of the Renaissance. So the next time you admire a Renaissance masterpiece, take a moment to look beyond the artist's signature. Think about the patron, the banker, the pope, the prince who made it all possible. Their ambition and their money are the invisible frame that holds the picture together, reminding us that great art is never created in a vacuum. It's a product of its time, a reflection of society, and a timeless conversation between creativity and power. Have you ever wondered what truly sparked the Renaissance, that incredible explosion of art, science, and culture that reshaped the world. We often think of Italy, of figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, but what if I told you a major catalyst came from the East, from the dramatic fall of a legendary city? Let's travel back to the mid-5th century. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was the shining heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a fortress of knowledge, a treasure chest of ancient Greek and Roman texts, art, and philosophy that had been largely lost to Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Imagine a library that held the secrets of Plato, Aristotle, and the great mathematicians of antiquity, all preserved while the West was navigating what we often call the Dark Ages. But in 1453, everything changed. The mighty Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, after a long and brutal siege, breached the city's legendary walls. The fall of Constantinople was a world-shattering event. It marked the end of the Roman Empire for good and sent shockwaves across Europe. For the scholars, artists, and thinkers living within its walls, it was a catastrophe. Their world was crumbling, and they faced an uncertain future under a new ruler. So, what did they do? They fled, carrying with them the most precious cargo imaginable, knowledge. They packed up ancient manuscripts, scientific treatises, and, most importantly, the intellectual traditions they had safeguarded for centuries. Their destination, the burgeoning city-states of Italy. Think about it from their perspective. Where would you go? You'd seek out places that valued what you had to offer. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome were experiencing a commercial and cultural boom. Wealthy merchant families, like the famous Medici in Florence, were eager to become patrons of the arts and sciences. They saw sponsoring scholars and artists as a way to gain prestige, showcase their power, and beautify their cities. Italy was a fertile ground, ready and waiting for the seeds of knowledge that these Byzantine refugees brought with them. When these scholars arrived, it was like opening a time capsule. They reintroduced Western Europe to a vast body of classical Greek literature and philosophy in its original language. Before this, Western scholars mostly knew of figures like Aristotle through Latin translations, which were often translations of Arabic versions. It was like a game of telephone over centuries. Now, they had direct access to the source code of Western civilization. This influx of new old ideas was electrifying. The humanism movement, which placed a renewed emphasis on human potential and achievements, caught fire. Instead of focusing solely on the divine and the afterlife, thinkers began to explore the human experience, reason, and the natural world. This was a radical shift in perspective, and it was fueled directly by the texts and ideas brought over from Constantinople. Let's talk about the art. Byzantine art had its own distinct style, formal. Spiritual, often characterized by golden backgrounds and elongated figures. It was beautiful and deeply symbolic. When these artistic traditions met the developing naturalism in Italy, something magical happened. Italian artists, who were already pushing boundaries and striving for greater realism, were suddenly exposed to new techniques, different ways of using color, and a wealth of classical stories and myths they hadn't fully explored before. This cross-pollination created a powerful synergy. You can see this influence in the work of early Renaissance masters. They began to blend the divine majesty of Byzantine art with a new, grounded, human-centric realism. Figures in paintings started to have weight, emotion, and individuality. They occupied real, three-dimensional spaces. Take a painter like Andrea Mantegna. His work is famous for its sculptural quality and its deep understanding of classical antiquity. Or consider the Bologna family in Venice, a city with strong trade ties to the East. Their paintings show a clear fascination with Eastern light, color, and detail. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the direct result of this cultural exchange. The refugees weren't just bringing books. They were bringing a living artistic heritage. This migration wasn't just a one-way street either. The fall of Constantinople also shifted trade routes, with the old overland routes to the east now controlled by the Ottomans. European explorers were incentivized to find new sea routes to Asia. This quest for new passages would eventually lead to Christopher Columbus sailing west and Vasco da Gama rounding Africa, kicking off the age of discovery. So, in a way, the end of one great city helped launch the exploration of the entire globe. It's fascinating how a single event, the fall of a city, can have such a profound and cascading effect on history. It acted like a cultural Big Bang. It scattered the brilliant minds of the Byzantine Empire across Europe, and where they landed, they ignited sparks of creativity and intellectual curiosity. They provided the missing ingredients that allowed the Italian Renaissance to flourish and transform from a local revival into a continent-wide revolution of thought and art. So, the next time you admire a Renaissance masterpiece, whether it is the serene beauty of a Raphael Madonna or the powerful anatomy of a Michelangelo sculpture, remember the long journey it took to get there. Remember the scholars and artists who fled a fallen city, carrying the torch of classical knowledge. They were the bridge between the ancient world and the modern one, and their migration was one of the key events that allowed the Renaissance to blossom, fundamentally changing the course of Western civilization forever. The role of the universities of Bologna and Padua in intellectual developments. When you think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Is it the breathtaking art of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, the daring voyages of explorers charting new worlds? Or perhaps the political intrigue of the Medici family? All of these are cornerstones of that incredible era. But behind the art, the exploration, and the politics, there was a powerful engine driving it all. A revolution in thought. Today, we're journeying back to the heart of this intellectual explosion, to northern Italy, to explore two institutions that were not just witnesses to their Renaissance, but were its chief architects. The universities of Bologna and Padua, these weren't just dusty halls of learning. They were vibrant, sometimes chaotic, hubs of innovation that fundamentally changed how we understand the world, the human body, and even the stars above. So, grab your notebook and let's uncover how these medieval universities lit the spark that would set the world ablaze with new knowledge. The story begins in Bologna, home to the oldest university in the Western world, founded way back in 1088. Initially, Bologna was the undisputed capital for the study of law. For centuries, scholars flocked here to master Roman and canon law, creating a system of legal thought that would shape European governance for ages. But as the 14th century dawned and the first whispers of the Renaissance began to stir, Bologna started to change. The focus began to shift from solely interpreting ancient legal texts to a broader, more exciting field: humanism. Scholars like Francesco Petrarca, often called the father of humanism, championed a return to the classical sources of ancient Greece and Rome, not just for law, but for poetry, philosophy, and rhetoric. Bologna became a hotbed for this new movement. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to just know the law. A truly educated person had to understand history, speak eloquently, and engage with the great moral questions posed by thinkers like Cicero and Seneca. This was a radical shift, placing humanity *humanitas* right at the center of intellectual life. This humanist spirit had a profound effect. It created an environment where critical thinking was celebrated. Instead of just accepting centuries of commentary, scholars in Bologna started going back to the original Greek and Latin sources themselves. They began comparing manuscripts, correcting errors that had been passed down for generations, and developing a new, rigorous approach to textual analysis. This might sound a bit academic, but its impact was massive. It fostered a mindset that valued evidence, precision, and questioning established authority. This very mindset, nurtured within the legal and humanist faculties of Bologna, laid the crucial groundwork for the scientific breakthroughs that were to come. The university was teaching people how to think, not just what to think, and that made all the difference. It was this spirit of inquiry that would soon find an even more radical home just a short journey away in the city of Padua. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the University of Padua, operating under the stable and forward-thinking governance of the Venetian Republic, had established itself as the leading center for science and medicine in all of Europe. While Bologna had laid the humanist foundation, Padua built a skyscraper of scientific discovery upon it. The motto of the university was Universia, Universis, Patavina Libertas, meaning Paduan freedom is universal for all. This wasn't just a catchy phrase. The Venetian government guaranteed a level of academic freedom unheard of elsewhere in Europe, where the Inquisition often held sway. This liberty attracted the brightest and most daring minds from across the continent, including a young Polish student named Nicolas Copernicus. It was in the intellectual melting pot of Padua that Copernicus was exposed to ideas that challenged the long-held geocentric model of the universe, planting the seeds for his revolutionary work that would place the sun, not the earth, at the center of our solar system. Padua's most dramatic contributions, however, were in the field of medicine. For centuries, medical knowledge was based almost entirely on the ancient texts of Galen, a Roman physician whose work contained brilliant insights but also significant errors, as he had primarily dissected animals, not humans. The professors at Padua changed everything. In 1594, the university built the world's first permanent anatomical theater, a stunning, tiered wooden structure that still exists today. Here, professors like Andreas Vesalius conducted public human dissections. Vesalius, a true revolutionary, trusted the evidence of his own eyes over the authority of ancient texts. In his groundbreaking 1543 book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body, he corrected over 200 of Galen's errors, creating the first truly accurate and detailed atlas of human anatomy. He showed his students the human body as it actually was, not as it was described in books. This was a monumental leap, establishing the principle of direct observation as the foundation of modern medicine. The legacy of Vesalius was carried on by his successors. Girolamo Fabrici, for instance, discovered the valves in our veins, a critical step towards understanding blood circulation. And one of Fabrici's own students, an Englishman named William Harvey, would later take this knowledge and, inspired by the mechanical and empirical spirit he absorbed at Padua, be the first to correctly describe the full circulation of blood being pumped by the heart. And it wasn't just medicine. A few years later, another professor would arrive at Padua, Galileo Galilei. Protected by Padua's academic freedom, Galileo turned his newly improved telescope to the heavens. He discovered the mountains on the moon, the moons of Jupiter, and the phases of Venus, providing observational evidence that shattered the old Aristotelian cosmos and supported the Copernican model. From the inner universe of the human body to the outer universe of the cosmos, Padua was the epicenter of a scientific earthquake. So, How did these two universities, Bologna and Padua, work together to shape the Renaissance? Think of it as a 1-2 punch. Bologna, with its deep roots in law and its embrace of humanism, cultivated a new way of thinking. It taught scholars to be rigorous, to value primary sources, and to place human reason and experience at the forefront. It created the intellectual toolkit for the Renaissance. Padua then took that toolkit and applied it with breathtaking results to the natural world. It took the humanist respect for observation and turned it into the scientific method. Padua provided the freedom and the facilities for thinkers like Vesalius and Galileo to challenge millennia of accepted dogma, not with rhetoric, but with empirical, verifiable proof. Bologna sharpened the minds, and Padua directed them toward the secrets of nature. Together, they formed a symbiotic relationship, an intellectual superhighway in northern Italy that transported ideas and brilliant people between them. The impact of these two institutions extends far beyond the Renaissance. The principles they championed are the very bedrock of our modern world. The idea that laws should be based on rational codes, the importance of a liberal arts education, the reliance on empirical evidence in science, the necessity of academic freedom, all of these can be traced back to the lecture halls and courtyards of Bologna and Padua. They transformed the university from a place for preserving old knowledge into a dynamic engine for creating new knowledge. They taught us that no authority is beyond question, and that the most profound truths are found not just in ancient books, but by looking closely at the world around us and within us. When we see a doctor who understands anatomy or an astronomer who maps distant galaxies, we are seeing the direct descendants of the intellectual revolution that unfolded in these two remarkable Italian cities. The Renaissance was not just the rebirth of arts and culture, but a fundamental rewiring of the human mind. The universities of Bologna and Padua were the master electricians of this transformation. They took the flickering embers of classical thought, fanned them with the spirit of humanism, and ignited a fire of scientific inquiry that continues to light our way today. They proved that, with intellectual rigor and the freedom to question, humanity's potential for discovery is limitless. Differences between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance journeying back in time to one of the most transformative periods in human history. The Renaissance, when we hear that word, we often picture Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's David. But that's only half the story. The Renaissance wasn't just one single monolithic event. It unfolded differently across Europe. So, grab your virtual passport, because we're about to explore the fascinating differences between the Italian Renaissance and its equally brilliant cousin, the Northern Renaissance. Let's start where it all began. Italy in the 14th century. The Italian Renaissance was, in many ways, a direct throwback to classical antiquity. Think ancient Greece and Rome. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Rome were bustling centers of trade, and wealthy patrons like the Medici family had the money and the ambition to fund incredible artistic and architectural projects. They wanted to recapture the glory of the Roman Empire. This is why Italian Renaissance art is so focused on balance, symmetry, and idealized human forms. Artists studied anatomy to portray the human body with stunning accuracy. They were obsessed with perspective, creating realistic, three-dimensional scenes on a two-dimensional surface. It was all about bringing classical harmony and humanism, the celebration of human potential, and achieving back to the forefront. When you look at Raphael's School of Athens, you're not just seeing a beautiful painting. You're seeing a philosophical statement about the greatness of human intellect, directly inspired by classical ideals. Now, let's travel north of the Alps to places like Flanders, the Netherlands, and Germany, where the Renaissance took on a completely different flavor. The Northern Renaissance started a bit later, around the 5th-10th century, and it wasn't as directly connected to the ruins of ancient Rome. Instead, it grew out of the late medieval Gothic tradition and was deeply intertwined with a movement called Christian humanism, while Italian humanists focused on secular classical models. Northern humanists, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, sought to reform the Catholic Church and society through a deeper, more personal understanding of early Christian texts. They wanted to create a more ethical and pious society. This profound religious sentiment is vividly reflected in their art. So, how does this difference in focus play out visually? While Italian artists were painting grand frescoes of mythological scenes and biblical stories in a classical style, Northern artists were masters of a different domain: oil paint on wood panels. This new medium allowed for an incredible level of detail and realism that was almost photographic. Think of Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait. Look closely, and you can see every single thread in the fabric. The reflection in the mirror on the back wall, it's mind-blowing. This intense realism wasn't just for show. Northern artists used it to infuse everyday objects with complex religious symbolism. A simple lily in the background wasn't just a flower, it represented the Virgin Mary's purity. A snuffed-out candle could symbolize the divine presence. Their subjects were also different. Instead of idealized nudes and classical heroes, they often painted detailed portraits of wealthy merchants and scenes of everyday peasant life, as seen in the work of Peter Bruegel the Elder. They found divinity in the mundane, in the details of the world around them. Let's talk about subject matter a bit more. In Italy, the dominant themes were mythology, classical history, and religious scenes rendered with humanistic grandeur. The focus was on the ideal, the heroic, the monumental. You get powerful, dynamic figures like Michelangelo's David, a perfect representation of human strength and beauty. In the North, the focus was more introspective and detailed. While they certainly painted religious subjects, they did so with a focus on intense emotion and piety. Think of Matthäus, Granules, Isen, Altarpiece. It's a raw, almost brutally emotional depiction of the crucifixion, designed to inspire deep personal devotion and empathy in the viewer. There's less classical idealism and more Gothic, emotional intensity. Portraiture was also huge in the North, capturing not just the likeness of a person, but their status, their piety, and even a sense of their inner psychological state, as seen in the work of Albrecht Dürer. The impact of the printing press also created a major divergence. Invented in Germany by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, the printing press revolutionized the North. It allowed for the mass production of books and pamphlets, including Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which kicked off the Protestant Reformation. This made written ideas, especially those of Christian humanists and reformers, accessible to a much wider audience. Artistically, this led to the rise of printmaking, with artists like Albrecht Dürer creating incredibly detailed woodcuts and engravings that could be reproduced and sold to the public. Art was no longer just for the wealthy patron or the church. It could be owned by the emerging middle class. In Italy, while the printing press was used, the artistic culture remained more centered on unique, commissioned masterpieces, like large-scale frescoes and sculptures that couldn't be easily reproduced. The art remained more exclusive. So, to sum it all up, think of it this way. The Italian Renaissance was like a grand, sun-drenched classical opera. It was bold, idealistic, and focused on recreating the perfection of ancient Greece and Rome, celebrating human greatness on a monumental scale. The Northern Renaissance, on the other hand, was more like an intimate, richly detailed chamber piece. It was introspective, pious, and focused on capturing the intricate details of the real world and the inner spiritual life. One looked back to the classical past for inspiration, while the other looked inward, seeking a more personal and reformed faith. Both were revolutionary. Both produced some of the greatest art the world has ever seen, and together they completely reshaped Western civilization, paving the way for the modern world. They weren't rivals, but two different, brilliant expressions of a single, powerful idea that humanity was entering a new dawn of creativity and discovery. I hope this journey through the two Renaissances has been as fascinating for you as it is for me. It just goes to show how a single historical movement can have such diverse and beautiful expressions. What's your favorite piece of Renaissance art? Italian or Northern? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The impact of Mediterranean trade relations on cultural flourishing. We're journeying back in time to one of the most transformative periods in human history. We often think of it as a time of breathtaking art and brilliant minds, but what really lit the fuse for this incredible explosion of creativity? The answer, in large part, floats on the sparkling waters of the Mediterranean Sea. You see, the Renaissance, which spanned from the 14th to the 17th century, wasn't just an artistic movement. It was a complete rebirth of European culture, science, and thought. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why it began in Italy, we need to look at geography and economics. For centuries, Europe had been somewhat fragmented after the fall of the Roman Empire. But by the late Middle Ages, a powerful new force was rising: trade. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were perfectly positioned at the heart of the Mediterranean. They became the crucial middlemen between the markets of Europe and the rich. Advanced civilizations of the East, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. Ships laden with spices, silks, dyes, and other exotic goods from Asia and Africa would arrive in Italian ports, and from there, these treasures would travel across the continent. This trade was unbelievably lucrative. It created a new class of incredibly wealthy merchant families. Think of the Medici in Florence, for example. They weren't kings or feudal lords. They were bankers and traders who amassed fortunes that would make royalty blush. And what do you do when you have more money than you could ever spend? You start investing in things that showcase your power, status, and intellect. You become a patron. This is where the magic really starts. These patrons, the Medici, di Sforza, in Milan. The popes in Rome began competing with each other, not just with armies, but with culture. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and magnificent buildings. They wanted to beautify their cities and immortalize their own names. They poured money into funding artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. Without the immense wealth generated by Mediterranean trade, these artists might never have had the opportunity to create their masterpieces. The Sistine Chapel's ceiling wasn't funded by a bake sale. It was funded by the immense wealth flowing through the heart of Italy. But the ships sailing the Mediterranean carried more than just spices and silk. They carried ideas. They carried knowledge. As Italian merchants traveled to places like Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and two ports in North Africa and the Levant, they encountered a world brimming with intellectual treasures. The Islamic world at that time was a global center of science, mathematics, and philosophy. They had preserved and expanded upon the ancient knowledge of the Greeks and Roman thinkers, like Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy works that had been largely lost to Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Arab scholars had made incredible advancements in algebra, astronomy, and medicine. When Byzantine scholars fled to Italy after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, they brought with them a treasure trove of ancient Greek manuscripts. Suddenly, Italian thinkers had direct access to the original writings of the classical world, unfiltered in their original language. It was like discovering a lost library of genius. This rediscovery of classical knowledge sparked a movement called humanism. Humanism shifted the focus from a purely religious, afterlife-centered worldview to one that celebrated human potential, achievement, and life on earth. It encouraged the spirit of inquiry, critical thinking, and a deep appreciation for human reason and creativity. People started to believe that humans were capable of extraordinary things in this life, not just the next. This new mindset is the very engine of the Renaissance. It's why we see Leonardo da Vinci studying human anatomy to paint more realistically and also designing flying machines. It's a celebration of human capability. The fusion of Eastern knowledge with this new humanist spirit was electrifying. The introduction of Arabic numerals, including the concept of zero, made complex calculations in banking and engineering possible. Advancements in astronomy, learned from Islamic texts, helped navigators sail farther and more accurately. Medical knowledge from scholars like Avicenna revolutionized the study of medicine in Italian universities. This wasn't just a one-way street. The Europeans brought their own innovations, like the printing press, which then supercharged the spread of all this rediscovered knowledge across the continent. But the initial spark, that first collision of wealth, classical ideas, and Eastern science, happened in the bustling port cities of Italy. So, when we admire the serene beauty of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, or stand in awe of Brunelleschi's magnificent dome on the Florence Cathedral, we're not just looking at a work of art. We are looking at the end product of a long and complex supply chain that began on the trade routes of the Mediterranean Sea. We're seeing the result of a merchant's successful voyage, a banker's savvy investment, and a scholar's rediscovery of an ancient text. The Renaissance teaches us a powerful lesson, that cultural flourishing is often born from connection, not isolation. It happens when different cultures meet, exchange goods, and, most importantly, share ideas. The wealth from trade provided the fuel, but the exchange of knowledge provided the spark that ignited one of the most brilliant periods in our shared human story. The azure waters of the Mediterranean were not just a trade route, they were a conduit for civilization itself, carrying the seeds of the modern world. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live through a time when the world was literally being reborn, a time when art, science, and ideas exploded in a way that hadn't been seen for 1,000 years? That's exactly what the Renaissance was, a rebirth that completely reshaped Europe and, eventually, the entire world. And at the heart of this incredible transformation was one single, game-changing invention, the printing press. Let's rewind the clock. Before the 14th century, Europe was deep in the Middle Ages. Life, for most people, was tough, and knowledge was a luxury, locked away in monasteries. Books were incredibly rare and precious because each one had to be painstakingly copied by hand by scribes. Imagine spending months, or even years, just to create a single copy of a book. This made books astronomically expensive, something only the ultra-wealthy or the church could afford. Knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a very small elite group. For the average person, the world of ideas was a distant, inaccessible castle. But then, starting in Italy, something began to shift. The air started to crackle with new energy. Scholars and artists began looking back, not to the recent past, but way back to the golden ages of ancient Greece and Rome. They rediscovered the works of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, the stunning sculptures, the brilliant architecture. This wasn't just about copying the past. It was about being inspired by it to create something new. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, a French word that literally means rebirth. This new way of thinking was called humanism. It placed human beings, our potential, our creativity, and our experiences right at the center of the universe. Instead of focusing solely on the divine and the afterlife, people started to celebrate the beauty and wonder of the world right here, right now. This shift in perspective lit a fire under artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. They weren't just painting religious scenes anymore. They were studying human anatomy to make their figures more realistic, using mathematics to create perfect perspective and capturing the subtle emotions on a human face. Think of the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile or the raw power of the statue of David. This was art that felt alive, that connected with people on a deeply human level. Science was also taking a giant leap forward. People like Copernicus started looking up at the stars and questioning everything they'd been taught. He proposed that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, but that it actually revolved around the sun. This was a radical, earth-shattering idea at the time. Galileo Galilei, with his newly developed telescope, would later provide the evidence to back it up, getting him into a lot of trouble, but ultimately proving that observation and experimentation were the keys to unlocking the universe's secrets. This explosion of art, science, and philosophy was incredible, but it was happening in relatively small, isolated pockets. Ideas were still traveling at the speed of a horse-drawn cart or a ship. A new scientific discovery or a brilliant poem might take years to spread from Florence to Paris or London. The Renaissance was like a powerful engine, but it was running on low fuel. It needed a way to supercharge the spread of knowledge. And then, around the year 1440, in Mainz, Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg had an idea that would change everything. He combined several existing technologies, the screw press used for making wine, the craft of metalworking, and the concept of block printing from Asia to create something revolutionary. The printing press with movable type instead of carving an entire page onto a single block of wood. Gutenberg created individual letters and symbols out of metal. These little pieces of type could be arranged to form words, sentences, and entire pages. Once a page was set, you could ink it, press it onto paper, and create a copy in seconds. And the best part, when you were done, you could take all the letters apart and reuse them to create a completely new page. This was the spark that ignited the wildfire of the Renaissance. The first major book Gutenberg printed was, fittingly, the Bible. Suddenly, a book that would have taken a scribe years to copy could be mass-produced. In the first 50 years after Gutenberg's invention, an estimated 20 million books were printed in Europe. That's more books than had been produced in the entire previous millennium. By the year 1600, that number had exploded to over 200 million. The impact was immediate and profound. The price of books plummeted. For the first time in history, knowledge was not just for kings and bishops. It was becoming accessible to merchants, craftsmen, and a growing middle class, literacy rates began to climb as more people had a reason to learn to read. Universities, which had been small and exclusive, began to flourish as students could now access textbooks and the latest research from scholars across the continent. Think about it. A scientist in Poland, like Copernicus, could publish his findings. Within months, his book could be in the hands of another scientist in Italy, like Galileo, who could then build upon those ideas. Knowledge was no longer a one-way street. It was a conversation, a collaboration happening in real time across hundreds of miles. Scientific and medical texts, once filled with errors from centuries of hand copying, could now be standardized and corrected. This accelerated the scientific revolution, laying the groundwork for figures like Isaac Newton. The printing press also fueled massive social and religious change. Martin Luther, a German monk, was frustrated with the practices of the Catholic Church. In 1517, he wrote his 95 Theses, a list of arguments against church corruption. In an earlier era, his ideas might have been squashed locally, but thanks to the printing press, his writings were printed, copied, and distributed all over Germany and Europe within weeks. It went viral des 16th century style. This sparked the Protestant Reformation, a movement that split the church and completely redrew the religious and political map of Europe. The press gave a voice to reformers and allowed ordinary people to read the Bible in their own languages for the first time, interpreting it for themselves. The world was shrinking. Maps, once rare and wildly inaccurate, could now be printed and updated with the latest discoveries from explorers like Columbus and Magellan. This fueled the age of discovery, as accurate charts made long-distance sea voyages less daunting. News, pamphlets, and journals began to appear, informing people about current events, politics, and distant wars. A shared public consciousness started to form. People in London could read about what was happening in Venice, creating a sense of a connected European society. So, when you think of the Renaissance, don't just picture beautiful paintings and magnificent domes. Picture the clatter and hum of the printing press, the machine that was the true engine of this rebirth. It took the brilliant sparks of genius from artists and scientists and fanned them into a continent-wide inferno of change. It democratized knowledge, empowered individuals, and built the foundations of our modern, information-rich world. Every time you read a book, scroll through a news website, or watch a video like this one, you are experiencing the legacy of Gutenberg's invention. It was the original information superhighway, and it showed us that the most powerful force in the world isn't a sword or a crown, but a shared idea. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this exploration of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events and inventions that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to see next. See you in the next video, and now, let the fire take you into a world of calm and dreams.